The concerns in the region about Iran targeting oil facilities, and there are significant concerns about how this war could disrupt the global economy. Oil and gas prices spiked today as the regional conflict escalated and shipping was disrupted in the Strait of Hormuz. About 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas flows through the strait every day. Straits of Hormuz are this like choke point in the Persian Gulf. 20% of the world's oil passes through there. And right now, you've got ships essentially parked on either side of the street. If energy markets ever needed a moment that exposes how fragile global supply lines really are, this is it. One of the most important shipping corridors on Earth has suddenly gone silent. Tanker traffic has stalled across the Gulf, and countries that rely on Middle Eastern oil are scrambling to secure fuel before supplies tighten even further. At the center of this shock sits a country that built an alternative route long before the crisis arrived. Canada now controls one of the few large energy supplies that avoids the chaos entirely, and the consequences are already spreading into American fuel prices. The Strait of Hormuz has always carried enormous weight in the global energy system because the narrow waterway connects the Persian Gulf to the wider world and serves as the main passage for oil and liquefied natural gas leaving the Middle East. Under normal conditions, roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply moves through that single corridor, and about 100 tankers pass through the strait every day, transporting crude and gas toward markets in Asia, Europe, and North America. Once the conflict surrounding Iran intensified and military threats escalated, that corridor effectively shut down as shipping companies began withdrawing vessels while insurance coverage evaporated and naval tensions pushed commercial traffic away from the region. The result turned one of the busiest shipping routes on Earth into an eerie standstill, where vessels carrying enormous quantities of crude suddenly found themselves stranded with nowhere to go. According to maritime data from Lloyd's List, roughly 200 tankers became trapped in the strait and surrounding Gulf waters after shipping activity collapsed, leaving thousands of seafarers stuck in a dangerous war zone while waiting for a situation that nobody can confidently predict. Some vessels sit anchored near the coast of Dubai. Others remain scattered throughout the Gulf. And each tanker represents millions of barrels of oil that cannot move toward global markets. One crew member aboard a crude tanker described the moment the crisis unfolded while the vessel was loading oil at an industrial facility somewhere in the Gulf region. Orders first came to stop loading cargo after explosions lit the sky in the distance. Then, hours later, another command instructed the crew to resume filling the ship despite the chaos unfolding nearby. The tanker eventually carried more than 1 million barrels of crude oil while communication systems faltered. GPS signals disappeared and the crew waited in darkness while military aircraft roared overhead. Now that vessel sits motionless with more than 20 seafarers on board, including workers from India and the Philippines, sending periodic messages to their employer while hoping that the violence around them does not reach their ship. From inside the cabin, the crew member described how explosions sometimes flash across the sky while fighter jets pass overhead, creating a surreal atmosphere where routine work continues even though a major conflict unfolds nearby. Limited internet access and disrupted satellite signals make communication difficult, and the crew relies on brief messages to reassure family members that everyone remains safe. The tanker has enough food and desalinated water to sustain the crew for around 60 days. Although rationing may eventually become necessary if the shutdown continues longer than expected, international maritime unions have begun receiving urgent messages from sailors trapped across the region as the closure drags on, with many workers asking whether evacuation or crew replacement is possible. Leaders at the International Transport Workers Federation say seafarers often remain invisible during geopolitical crisis, even though global trade depends entirely on their work. The organization represents more than 1.2 million maritime workers and now faces growing pressure to help crew members who suddenly find themselves stuck in one of the most volatile shipping regions in the world. Stephen Cotton, the Federation's General Secretary, explained that seafarers are civilians who happen to be performing their jobs in a region that has become extremely dangerous. Maritime unions are trying to determine whether crew members who want to leave their ships can be repatriated safely. Yet, ship owners have warned that the surrounding waters currently represent a no-go zone for movement. The logistical challenge becomes even more complicated because replacing crew members in an active conflict zone would require workers willing to take enormous risks simply to step it aboard a tanker. Reports indicate that at least 6 vessels have already been attacked in the area, and 2 seafarers have lost their lives during the escalating violence, while a major explosion was reported near the coast of Kuwait involving an oil tanker earlier this week. Each new incident deepens the sense of uncertainty surrounding the region and pushes shipping companies further away from attempting transit through the strait. Marine insurers have responded by raising premiums dramatically or withdrawing coverage altogether, making commercial voyages through the corridor financially impossible, even for operators willing to accept the risk. The economic consequences of such a disruption stretch far beyond the Gulf because the global oil market depends on constant movement from production fields to refineries. When a route carrying roughly 20% of the planet's energy supply suddenly stops functioning, prices react quickly and supply chains begin searching for alternatives. Every country that relies on Middle Eastern oil must now secure new sources while millions of barrels remain trapped on tankers that cannot safely leave the region. One country happens to sit outside this crisis with a completely different route to international markets, and that country is Canada. Canadian energy exports travel primarily through pipelines and coastal terminals that do not pass anywhere near the Strait of Hormuz or the Red Sea, allowing shipments to continue even while Middle Eastern routes collapse. A major pipeline connecting Alberta's oil sands to Canada's Pacific coast now transports about 890,000 barrels of crude oil each day toward shipping terminals where tankers can head west across the Pacific Ocean toward Asian markets. The journey from Canada's Pacific coast to Asia takes roughly 10 days, which is about half the time required for Middle Eastern cargo traveling the traditional route when the Strait of Hormuz remains open. In the current situation, the Middle Eastern route cannot operate at all, leaving many countries suddenly aware that one of the few stable suppliers sits thousands of miles away in North America. Canada also controls enormous energy reserves that give the country a powerful position during any global supply shock. Canadian oil reserves total approximately 163 billion barrels of proven crude, placing the country 4th in the world behind only Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. Production levels approach 6 million barrels per day when counting conventional oil along with output from Alberta's massive oil sands operations. These numbers mean Canada supply a large portion of international demand without relying on vulnerable shipping lanes that cross conflict zones. Natural gas exports add another layer to Canada's energy influence. A major liquefied natural gas terminal on the coast of British Columbia now sends LNG cargo toward Asia and operates at a capacity capable of supporting roughly 170 tanker shipments each year when running at full output. South Korea already purchases Canadian LNG from that facility, creating a direct energy link that bypasses the geopolitical tensions surrounding Middle Eastern gas supplies. These resources have transformed Canada from a regional supplier into a country capable of filling gaps in global markets whenever disruptions occur elsewhere. For years, Canadian producers sold the overwhelming majority of their crude to the United States, because pipelines flowed south into American refineries and alternative export routes barely existed. That arrangement kept Canadian oil prices significantly lower than global benchmarks since producers had limited options for selling their supply. Discounts sometimes reached astonishing levels. Canadian crude occasionally sold for $40 to $60 less per barrel than international oil prices. While Middle Eastern producers often sold their output for only about $10 below benchmark rates, American refineries benefited enormously from that arrangement because Canadian producers had little leverage to demand higher prices when their entire export system depended on a single customer. The situation looks very different once the Strait of Hormuz shuts down and global markets begin searching for stable supplies. When benchmark oil prices climb toward $100 per barrel because shipments from the Gulf cannot move, Canadian crude suddenly carries far more value than it did under the old system. Buyers across Asia and Europe recognize that Canadian oil travels through secure routes and therefore represents a dependable alternative. While the Middle East remains unstable, demand has already begun appearing from countries that rarely purchased Canadian energy before. India stands near the top of that list because the nation imports roughly 90% of its oil and previously relied heavily on shipments passing through the Strait of Hormuz. With fewer than 10 days of emergency reserves available in storage, India faces urgent pressure to secure new suppliers capable of delivering crude quickly. During recent diplomatic conversations, an Indian official reportedly told Canadian representatives that India would purchase whatever Canada is offering, a statement that reflects the intensity of the current shortage. A country with 1.4 billion people cannot allow its energy supply to collapse, and the sudden loss of Middle Eastern shipments forces decision-makers in New Delhi to pursue any reliable alternative. Japan faces similar exposure because the island nation imports nearly all of its energy resources and must rely on maritime routes to keep refineries operating. South Korea has already established a foothold in Canadian energy markets through long-term LNG purchases, and that arrangement now appears remarkably strategic as gas shipments from the Gulf face uncertainty. European countries also watch the situation closely because many governments spent years reducing dependence on Russian gas and now worry that Middle Eastern supply routes could become unreliable as well. Canada possesses something extremely valuable in this environment because the country produces oil, natural gas, liquefied natural gas, and uranium, while exporting those resources through routes that avoid the world's most dangerous choke points. Few nations can claim such a combination of resources and infrastructure at a moment when global supply lines feel increasingly fragile. Canada spent years building the infrastructure that made this pivot possible. The expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline dramatically increased the country's capacity to move oil from Alberta toward the Pacific coast, nearly tripling export capability through that corridor. Within a single year, non-American exports of Canadian crude increased by approximately 289% as new buyers across Asia began testing shipments from the newly expanded route. China alone purchased around 100 million barrels of Canadian oil during an 11-month period as tankers began appearing more frequently at Pacific terminals. The construction of LNG Canada in northern British Columbia marked another massive step forward because the $40 billion facility represents the largest private investment ever made in Canadian history. With its first cargo already shipped and operations underway, the terminal provides a direct gateway for natural gas exports across the Pacific. Alberta's oil sands industry alone employs more than 150,000 people directly, while supporting hundreds of thousands of additional jobs throughout the supply chain, from equipment manufacturing to transportation and engineering services. Rising oil prices increase royalty payments to provincial governments and expand investment across communities connected to the industry. 18 months ago, many analysts argued that Canada had little choice but to sell its energy almost entirely to the United States because no alternative export infrastructure existed. That assumption no longer holds true. Years of investment have created new routes that allow Canadian resources to reach global markets, and those routes now provide leverage during one of the most significant energy disruptions in recent memory. South Korea's LNG purchases represent a long-term commitment that will continue delivering Canadian gas across the Pacific. India's emerging uranium agreement with Saskatchewan producers covers roughly 10 years of supply worth about $2.8 billion. future pipeline capacity toward the Pacific will likely attract additional long-term buyers seeking to protect themselves from disruptions similar to the current shutdown in the Strait of Hormuz. Each new contract strengthens Canada's position as a stable supplier that operates outside the volatile shipping lanes of the Middle East. Countries that recently realized how vulnerable those routes can be may prefer suppliers capable of delivering energy without passing through contested waters. So, what do you think? Tell us in the comments. Thanks for tuning in.